All right, we are going to continue today with our series on the John Ortberg's book, If You Want to Walk on Water, You've Got to Get Out of the Boat. We've been, I think, 3 weeks in this now, and so we're going to continue today with week 4. And as we begin, we're going to read the scripture passage on which this sermon series is based. Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. If you're using one of our worship Bibles, page 970. Again, the context is immediately following Jesus' miracle of the multiplication of the bread and the loaves, where he fed 5,000 people with a small amount of food, miraculously. So when it says immediately, that's referring to Jesus dismissing the crowd from that event. Matthew 14, 22 to 33. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But then he saw the wind, and he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And they climbed into the boat. The wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the word of the Lord. Today, the important part I want to start with is that we have to understand that Peter was not in charge of water walking. Jesus was. You know, Peter didn't declare, "Okay, Lord, if that's you, I'm jumping out of the boat and I'm going to walk to you." Instead, he told Jesus, in the NIV here, it says, "If it's you, tell me to come." In some of the more precise word-for-word translation versions, the New Revised Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible, it says, "If it's you, command me to come to you." And so the idea that Peter wasn't just doing this on his own. He had the idea, he wanted to walk on water and get out there. So he told Jesus, "If it's really you, give me the order. Command me to come to you, or tell me to come to you," depending on the translation you're using. So that's the important point, that Peter recognized it was Jesus in charge. Now, we're told early in the story that the disciples were afraid, and Jesus told them, "Don't be afraid." And we are told that, in fact, I told you a week or two ago, that it said that that's the #1 command in the Bible numerically. If you go through the Bible and count all of Jesus telling people to do this or do that, and don't be afraid is like #1. He says that more than any other command. Apparently we're afraid a lot. We have great fear. But the reality is, there's another command that's not as popular and isn't told as much, but it goes hand in hand with it. And that is, don't be ridiculous. For Peter to have said on his own, "I'm going to jump out of the boat and walk on water," that would have been kind of ridiculous. That would have been kind of silly. If you try to do that without God telling you to, not smart. And so that idea about, I want to be bold and courageous and do great things for the Lord, and I'm going to be stupid things. Now, there's a thin line, and you're going to have to squint your eyes to see it probably, because I made it thin on purpose. There's a thin line between don't be afraid and don't be ridiculous. We want to make sure that we're not holding back because of fear, but that doesn't mean we want to just go out and do stupid stuff. I'm gonna jump off this building to bring glory to the Lord, and you jump off the building and fall to your death. That wasn't being not afraid, that was being ridiculous. And we have to keep the difference between the two. In fact, Paul in Ephesians chapter 5, and I'm going to go ahead and turn there. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 to 17. Paul gives this instruction. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, or I would say ridiculous, but understand what the Lord's will is. So that idea about, you want to be bold and faithful and not afraid, that doesn't mean you have a license to be stupid. You see all these people, I don't need to take precaution, I don't need to be careful, I don't need to plan ahead. The Lord's going to just take care of this, the Lord's going to take care of that. Don't be ridiculous. Unless the Lord is telling you to, then it changes everything. But without the Lord, we said it about Peter, it's true about us. We are not in charge of water walking. Jesus is. I've been encouraging you for 3 weeks now to walk on water. But I want you to do it as Jesus tells you to. Don't just walk on the water on any category, anything at all, but do it as Jesus tells us to. In other words, when we step out in faith, we have to make sure that God is calling us to do so. There was a movie some years ago called The Gospel Blimp, where these guys got the idea that to serve the Lord, we're going to rent a blimp, and we're going to drop tracts from the sky all over the city. And so the movie was about all of the stuff that comes and goes, and they ended up getting fined a bunch of money for littering and so on and so forth. And the bottom line is like they had the idea. It was never God's direction to tell them to get a blimp and drop flyers from the sky. That was their doing, and they finally learned the lesson that while it was a bold move, and to pay for it and all of that, they had to step out in faith. But it was really stepping out on presumption, because God hadn't told them to get a gospel blimp and do that kind of thing. Frank Farley, a genetic, psychological type guy, identified what he called the type T personality. And he said, we all have different personality types. Type T, he said, was the thrill-seeking personality. And after doing a whole bunch of studies, he said that while there's a few exceptions here and there because of one thing or another, by and large, it's the type T personality that ends up involved in extreme sports, for example. They're the ones who think it's a good idea to take a race car 220 miles an hour around the racetrack. They're the ones who think it's a good idea to base jump. You know what base jumping is? That's where you get to only about 500 feet or so high, and then you jump off with a parachute. And if you know anything about parachutes, part of the deal is it takes them a little bit to unfurl and to take effect, and 500 feet is considered a dangerous level to do that from. There's a good chance you're going to hit the ground before the parachute is doing its job. And so base jumping is illegal in a lot of places. Most places, I think, that people do it anyways. They sneak around and they jump off tall buildings and bridges and cliffs and that kind of thing with nothing but a parachute. They're type T personality. There's another Israeli genetic scientist group that uncovered what they call gene number D4DR, and they said that's the risk-taking gene. We've identified people that are type T personalities, people that like to take risks all the time. Their D4DR gene is different than normal people's. It is that gene that gives them the risk-taking ability. So our question is, are water walkers those who are type T, those with the D4DR gene, or the difference in the D4DR gene? Marcia's shaking her head no, and she's right. That is not the answer. Water walkers aren't because they're type T or because they're D4DR gene. They're instead what we call the type W gene. And instead of the D4DR, it's the SFIG gene. We call it the type W simply for water walking. They have they're the water walking type, and they have the SFIG gene, which isn't a specially elongated gene that gives you more risk-taking pronation, but rather the subservient faith in God gene. You have that gene that runs that balance between I'm serving God, I'm listening to Him, I'm following His orders, but I have faith in God to do so. So I would never step out of the boat and try to walk on water by myself. That would be stupid and ridiculous. But if God tells me to get out of the boat and to walk on water, I'm going to obey Him, and I'm going to have enough faith in Him to understand that it's okay, that I can do this. And so that SFIG gene. So I want to kind of apply this to our lives a little bit. When we talk about our vocations, the way that we live, the things that we do, when we're looking for a vocation or a career, we often ask the question, what do I want to do with my life? And we focus on that question, try to come up with a good answer, and then that's what we pursue. But really, that's the wrong question. When you're looking for what to do with your life, we need to realize that that we're not supposed to be choosing. We're supposed to be listening. You don't choose a vocation, you listen for what your vocation is supposed to be. That is, we expect a calling. Now, I know a lot of times people talk about a calling for very specialized things. We talk about maybe some doctors felt called to be doctors, or teachers have a calling, and of course pastors have a calling. But really a calling is for everyone. Everyone should be listening to God about what it is He wants you to do with your life. And that's in terms of the big things and the smaller things as well. God has a plan. And so we should be asking, not choosing or listening. In fact, here's something I didn't know until recently. The word vocation actually comes from the Latin for voice, because our vocation is something that we hear, not something that we choose. It's the voice. It's what God tells us to do. And so when instead of asking, what do I want to do with my life, we should be asking two questions. And the first question is this what you are called to do? It might sound appealing to you, and it might sound fun and interesting and make you a lot of money, but is it what you're being called to do? And then, of course, if it is, the question comes up, is God doing the calling? Is it God's voice that you're hearing as opposed to some other voice? And we can talk a lot about different kinds of voices. But as we answer that and begin to move forward, we need to balance that with courage and wisdom. Remember, we said that it's not just courage, but we can't be stupid. We can't be ridiculous. So you balance those two things. And so I want to give you five things or instructions that kind of help us get on board with the right calling, or to discern the call, hear the call, answer the call. The first one is, take your call seriously. Don't just act like it's insignificant or doesn't matter. Take it seriously. Be serious about the idea that what you're going to do with your life, what you're going to do vocationally, what you're going to do, what hobbies you're going to take up. So what is your call? And follow your call, and you'll be way happier than if you don't. There was, in the 80s, in fact 1980 it came out, the Blues Brothers movie. In this movie, Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi, two awesome comedians, they played, and by the way, they weren't just a blues band. In the movie, their last name is Blue. So it's Jake and Elwood Blue. And one of them gets out of prison. And when he gets out of prison, the two of them decide that they're going to go back to the school they grew up in and kind of see everybody. And they get there and discover, in fact, they say they're going to go visit the penguin. The penguin was the nun that took care of them. So they get back to the school and discover that it is being shut down and sold. And they decide that it's not a coincidence that they're there. They need to rescue their orphanage, their school that they grew up in. And so they set apart to do it. And they realize that given who they are and what their skill sets are, the best way for them to do that is to put on a concert. And so they're going to do a concert to raise money as a fundraiser for the school so they can save the school or their orphanage. And so they set apart doing that. And when they begin to go and they ask the question or they want to tell people what they're doing, they don't say, we're doing a concert. They don't say, we're doing a fundraiser to save the school. Instead they say,
you see, we're on a mission from God.
You see, we're on a mission from God. That is how they understood what they were doing. And I think the truth is, we need to think about our vocation in life. If you already recall, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And that becomes our mission. We need to be like Jake and Elwood and say,
you see, we're on a mission from God.
When we understand what we're doing in those terms, instead of, I'm teaching a class, I'm baking some cookies, we need to think about that at the base level. We're on a mission from God. Because that's what you're here for. You're here to serve God and to work on His mission. So take your call seriously and understand that what you're doing, and if you're not on a mission from God, you're wasting time. You really are. And you're going to end up in the wrong place. And you may end up with success the way that you want to measure it. Oh, I made a lot of money in my lifetime. I had a lot of fame in my lifetime, but that really wasn't your mission. And you're going to feel that vacancy in your life because you didn't accomplish what you were created to accomplish. Number 2, honor your raw material. Take into account who you are as you set about discerning what your calling is. As you're listening and you're thinking maybe it's this, does it match up with your raw material? Now, it doesn't have to be 100% match because God enables people when they step out. But there ought to be some correlation there. And we need to remember that giftedness is about more than just talents. We often think in terms of, I should be a musician because I can sing. Or I should be an executive because I'm a good organizer and motivator. But you need to include your passion. What do you care about? What burden has God put on you? When someone, I went to a financial seminar years ago, a long time ago. In fact, it was here. Before I moved here, I made arrangements to come to a John Maxwell workshop with the side task of scouting Kenosha before moving to Kenosha. That was kind of my excuse to come, was I'm going to come to this John Maxwell workshop. But one of the things he said is that People have pockets of giving. He said a lot of people, a lot of pastors, as a pastor, and I can agree with this, I would love to say, everybody give your tithes and offerings, and from our tithes and offerings, the board will kind of divvy it out. We'll give some to missions and some to Alabaster, and we'll give some to this, that, and the other. And he said, but if you do that, the bottom line is you're going to lose money, because there are people who have different pockets. And some people have a missions pocket. They're not going to give to help support your Nazarene colleges. They're not going to give to support building a new building. But if you say, we're going to raise money for this missionary, they're all in. They're going to give to missions because they have the missions pocket. That's what we mean by their passions. There are others who, I'm a firm believer in education. I'm going to give to the Nazarene Theological Seminary Fund. But I don't do so well when it comes to some of these other things that we raise money for. So you need to think in those terms about your passions. Author Frederick Buechner, scholar, said this: the place where your deepest gladness meets the world's deepest need. When the need's here and your passion is here, when they cross, that is the point where your calling probably is. It's going to have something to do with being able to fulfill your passion while meeting a great need. And so use that kind of a concept. And here's one that most of us aren't excited about. Number 3, use a clearness committee. The old Quakers used to do this practice, that they called them clearness committees. And the idea was anytime they had a big decision to make, anytime they were seeking guidance for the future, they would pull together a clearness committee, 4 or 5, 6 people, to kind of be their sounding board. And it was the task of the committee not to just tell them what to do, but to ask questions. So they would come to the person and say, well, if you follow this path, what's that going to mean with your relationships? How's that going to affect them? How's that going to affect this other thing? What is motivating you to want to do this? What do you really want to do? And one author said that he had been invited to become the president of a small college. And he said, I'm going to say, yes, I want to do this, but I need to go through the motions. I'm going to pull together my clearness committee and see what they have to say. And they asked him, so why is it that you want to do this? And he said, embarrassingly, I thought about it, and I struggled with it, and I realized that when push comes to shove, my primary motivation was, I want to see my picture on the wall with the name president under it. That's why I want this job. In other words, the status, the respect it would bring him. That's why he wanted the job. He didn't care that much about doing the work. He didn't care that much about what he was going to accomplish. He wanted the job, so he turned it down. You realize he wanted the job for the status. So, think about getting some people together and letting them ask you questions and holding you accountable. That's part of what the church family is all about. And it doesn't have to be, you have a guy in your church who happens to be a vocational counselor. It doesn't have to be him. People who serve the Lord and know you and are willing to pray about it, let them be your clearness committee. Number 4, conduct low-cost probes. In other words, experiment without taking great risks to kind of make sure that you're on the right track. And I have 4 suggestions for that. One is observe. So for example, if you decide that you're thinking maybe that you're called to be a Sunday school teacher or a youth leader, go to the youth leader or the pastor and say, hey, could I sit in on a couple of youth group meetings, just kind of see how things go and what it's like, and just observe. Another thing to do is to ask, can I be a helper? Can I come to Sunday school and help you tomorrow and kind of assist and kind of get a feel for what it's like to do the work? And then you could also volunteer short term. So, I've observed, I've watched the class, I've sat in on it and taken a look around, and now I find out that the teacher's going to be gone for a couple of weeks. Why don't I substitute? And I can fill in and volunteer, and after a couple of weeks of that, you'll have a lot better. And doing those things aren't going to cost you a great deal. You haven't given up everything else in the world. It's kind of like that same thing if you're talking about a vocation. Experiment with this other vocation while keeping your day job. Keep your day job and do some of this and experiment and see if your other vocation begins to work out before you jump foot first into it. And number 5, the last one, is forget the comfort test. The problem is that a lot of us Christians have been taught incorrectly that you should take the comfort test. You do it, do you feel comfortable doing it? Is God opening all the right doors and closing all the bad doors and all that, and that's how you tell if that's your calling or not. And the truth is, it's not necessarily going to be comfortable. God often calls us to do things outside of our comfort zones. And, it's going to be hard. One author said that when you're looking for taking a job, you should ask 3 questions. What needs to be done? Can I do it? Do I want to do it? And if those 3 are all yeses, then you take the job. But the truth is, can I do it? Well, you want your gifts to correlate a little bit, but the truth is, it's not getting out of the boat if you can already do it. Henry Blackaby, great author, said this: if the assignment I sense God is giving me is something I know I can handle, I know it's probably not from God. See how backward that is from the comfort test? If I know I can do it, then that's probably not God telling me to do it. Because when God tells me to do something, it's almost always beyond my own abilities, and I have to depend on God to get it done. I have to lean on Him and expect Him to resource me and empower me and perform miracles. I can't do it on His own. I can't get out of the boat and walk on the water on my own. That's part of that. And so along that lines, you should expect obstacles. That idea about, God just opened every door, it was easy. Expect obstacles. Things are going to come up to make it hard. Things are going to come up to try to get you not to. I know when my dad was in his 30s and was a factory worker and felt called to ministry. He was very uneducated, didn't have a lot of resources and training, and he began telling people, family and relatives, God's calling me to be a pastor. And some of his closest friends / and relatives, they didn't know the terms back in the day, but they set up an intervention. They got 2 or 3 of them together and came over and said, Wilson, think about what you're doing. You're going to lose your job, and you got this, you were raising kids, and this, that, and they did everything they could to talk him out of it because they thought it was a foolish idea. If he had listened to them, it wasn't a clearness committee that he put together. They did it on their own. If he had listened to them, he wouldn't have followed God's call. So they were an obstacle. And remember, when Jesus said, I'm going to Jerusalem, and Peter said, no, let's not go there. Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. What kind of an insult is that? So Peter, get behind me, Satan, because Peter was creating an obstacle and trying to talk him out of the call. And so he didn't. So expect obstacles. So those 5 things will help you to discern your call and to follow through on it. And then there's one that's not really part of the 5, but one last thing with which I close, and that is you have to remember that your mission is not for God or even from God, but with God. God never sends you on a mission alone. In fact, Henry Blackaby in another place has written that if you want to see what you ought to do, look around and see what God is doing, then ask Him if you can help. Look what God is doing, and ask if you can help. Our mission from God is mission with God. You're going to do it with God's help. Is the only way you're going to be able to do it. Let's pray.